with what's in front of us. Firstly, it's good to note that today is the 7th of Adar. 7th of Adar, of course, is a day which the Talmud tells us both marks the birth of Moshe, of Moses, and his passing. The Talmud tells us, not in the text in front of you, but the Talmud tells us that when Haman cast his lots, right? Purim is called Purim because of the word pur, which means a lot. So when Haman cast his lots, it landed in the month of Adar. He was very excited because he knew that Moshe passed away in the month of Adar, on the 7th of Adar. And he figured it's a month of bad luck. Moshe had died. Fantastic time to destroy the Jews. And the Gemara comments, but lo havayada, he didn't know that on that day he died and on that day he was born. So many of the commentaries discuss, if Haman was such a scholar and knew that Moshe had died on the 7th of Adar, why didn't he know he was born? Even though the death is more explicit, the birth is less explicit, but nonetheless, the sources are very similar into where they come from. And if Haman was such a scholar, why didn't he know both? So the simple explanation is that he knew Moshe was born on the 7th of Adar and that he died on the 7th of Adar. But Haman figured, that death cancels birth. There was a birth, that's great, but he's not here anymore. It's death. So death cancels birth, and therefore it's a good time to attack the Jewish people. But what he didn't know was, as the Talmud says, on that day he was born, and on that day he died, and on that day he was also born. As if what he didn't know wasn't just a question of not knowing the date, but knowing the effect of and relationship between birth and death. Specifically, Rashi in his commentary on that Gemara writes that what he didn't know was, he did not know that Moshe's birth atones for his death. Meaning to say, whereas Haman was thinking that death cancels birth, says the Talmud, he got it wrong. Birth atones for death. Now what does that mean? So it means is like this. When you speak of the soul isn't born, nor does the soul die. The soul just has stages. Stages before life in a body, stages of life in a body, and stages of life after the body. So when you think of it that way, then what's the relationship between birth and death, as it were? The relationship is that the way the person's born, the way that birth begins the way the person lives on this earth, and the way the person lives on this earth shapes the way the soul is in its death. Right? So if a person's life, while living, is such that it's dedicated to that which is beyond the physical body, then the birth itself, as it were, atones for death, in that the person's life that they lived keeps on living after. Why should it not? It's the same spiritual life, if it always was spiritual, even when in the body. In the words of the Talmud, the Gemara says elsewhere. The Gemara actually has two comments on two different people who the Talmud says didn't die. One is Yaakov, our forefather Jacob. The Gemara says Yaakov v'nu lemes, because the verse doesn't explicitly state that he dies. But the Gemara comments that Yaakov v'nu lemes, Yaakov v'nu didn't die. And the Gemara asks, did they waste their time? Didn't they do a funeral? Didn't they have eulogies? That's what the Gemara asks. So the Gemara explains, well, what we mean here is that if Yaakov's children are alive, so is he alive. When the Gemara makes a similar comment about Moshe Rabbeinu, elsewhere the Gemara says that Moshe didn't die, even though the verse explicitly states, and Moses died. But nonetheless, the Gemara says they didn't die. What does that mean? The verse says he died. So explains the Talmud, that in the same way he served Hashem and his people in his lifetime, he continued to serve Hashem and his people. The word Hashem and his people I'm adding. The Gemara just said that he served during his life and he served in his death. He keeps on serving, which would presumably mean both Hashem and the people. So a person whose life is dedicated not to the physical, but to the service of Hashem and his people, then that service, why should it not continue when the soul's not in the body? On the contrary, because of the life that he lived here, that life that the soul has after death has greater impact on this world in some sense than it did even during its lifetime. During its lifetime, the spiritual activity of this person is limited to the confines of the body, whereas after death, the spiritual service of that person is no longer limited to the confines of the body. Which is, all of this is echoed in the famous letter written by the first Chabad Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, printed in section 4 of Tanya, in the Gersa Kodesh, where there he is consoling the community of Jews in Israel who lost their mutual teacher. The Alter Rebbe had a teacher named Mendel of Vitebsk who moved to Israel, and when he died, so the Alter Rebbe, living in Russia, sent a letter of condolences to the community there, and there he explained to them that because your teacher, Mendel of Vitebsk, because his life while on earth was not his physical bodily life, but rather his love of Hashem, his fear of Hashem, his service of God, and you lived your lives in the service of God by his teaching, so you keep on living the service of God by his teaching, then combining these two Talmudic commentaries, one that says that Jacob is still alive because his children are alive. He is still alive, your teacher is still alive because you are living by the teachings that he taught. Why? Because his teachings, like the Gemara says about Moses, he still serves before his death, he still serves after his death. He still serves to fuel you in your service here now, your service of God here today, just like he did before his passing. And this is what Haman was missing. In his version of life, death cancels birth. Whereas in a spiritual service version of life, in a Jewish version of life, birth only intensifies with death. And as if to say, a tzaddik, Moshe Rabbeinu, a Jew whose life is dedicated to the service of God, to spiritual matters, then that life continues in even greater measure posthumously, and that was the big mistake of him. And so that's the message of the 7th of Adar, twofold. Number one, knowing that connection to the righteous, and in one way or another, every Jew is righteous, as the Gemara, as the Talmud declares in a number of places, that every Jew has, of course, famous Talmud, that every Jew has good deeds, like a pomegranate is filled with seeds. It's just a question of whether the soul has to go through a little bit of cleansing after, but the core is still there, and therefore connecting to those who have passed on through their good deeds is still available and still accessible in some way even greater than during their lifetime. And when a person's living, their good deeds can be covered by all kinds of externalities. But after posthumously, their goodness is freed from all of that trappings, and therefore we can connect to that even deeper level. That's number one. And number two, examining our own lives and thinking of highlighting the parts of our lives that transcend the physical, which all are born at some point, begin at some point, and end at some point. But if our life is dedicated to that which is beyond that, then we're truly living, as it were. So that's the message of today, the 7th of Adar. So since we're on the topic of Purim, we're looking at a famous passage in the Talmud on Purim, with respect to Purim. Now, what I'm about to share with you, notwithstanding the fact that I'm video recording this, but the Rebbe spoke about this Talmud, which I'm about to share with you, the explanation that the Rebbe shared. He spoke about it on Shabbos, not at the Purim gathering. And the reason why I didn't do it at the Purim gathering, he explained, because the Purim gathering was televised. And someone flipping through the channels might hear one or two lines of the talk and be completely like, this is crazy, and not get the full picture, not get the full explanation, and therefore would leave with the wrong impression of the story. So therefore he spoke it on Shabbat when there's no one flipping through the TV channels, because it's not televised, obviously. Whoever is there presumably was listening till the end. And he later edited the talk for publication, in which I suppose he trusted people would read through till the end and get the full context. All to say that if you're listening, or if you're here, stay till the end, because if you don't, it's a very bizarre passage in the Talmud. Okay, so this is the tractate Megillah, the tractate which discusses Purim and the Megillah as in general. So you're looking at it is bizarre, right? You read the English already? It's quite bizarre. So the famous story says, so the first is the halacha, the Jewish law, which Rabbi says that a person is obligated to drink wine on Purim to the point that he doesn't know the difference between cursed Haman and blessed Mordechai. This is the Talmud. This is the source for all the festivities on Purim in their grandeur. Let's put it that way. Then the Gemara relates that Rabbi and Rebbe prepared a Purim feast with each other, and they became intoxicated to the point that Rabbi rose and, direct quote, again, wait till the end, slaughtered Rebbe. The next day he became sober and realized what he had done. So Rabbi asked God for mercy and revived him. The next year, Rabbi said to Rebbe, let the master come and let us prepare a feast with each other. So let's have another party. Didn't you like it last year? So Rabbi Zeta said to him, look, miracles don't happen every day and not every hour, so let's calm down. I don't want to do this whole thing again where I die and you revive me. I don't want to do that. So this is the story. Obviously, the story is super perplexing. What does this mean? They got drunk to the point where one sage is slaughtering another sage. It's a bizarre kind of story. And let's learn. Let's learn. Sorry? Let's learn. Sorry? It's men are, yeah, exactly. Men are strange. Actually, I'll get to that in a second about men and women here. But yeah, so the story is obviously bizarre. What does this mean that one sage killed another? The commentaries point out that the Talmud says elsewhere about Rabbi, this Rabbi, that he was born at a certain hour known as Maidim. Maidim is an hour associated with harsh personality. And yeah, harsh personality. Harsh personality. And the Gemara there comments, or actually, I think Rabbi even says this, that someone who is born, no, the Talmud says that someone who's born in this hour, this harsh hour, should become a ritual slaughterer. So that his harsh personality goes out in preparing people's food rather than other things. And Rabbi there says, sorry?
What time is that?
Actually, there is a way of figuring it out, but we'll leave that for now. And Rabbi says, I was born at that hour. So there are commentaries which say that he had but nonetheless, I mean, you're talking about Rabbi, one of the great sages who's quoted all over the Talmud, harsh personality or not. I mean, seriously, he slaughtered a guy? I mean, this is crazy. This is completely bizarre. Which is why many of the commentaries just leave and say, look, the story is not literal. And it's not unheard of that Talmudic stories are to be taken literal. There's a famous, if I remember correctly, there are other sources which indicate that that stories can often be parables or homiletic like to be extrapolated in kind of spiritual meaning and not to be taken fully literal. And there are many commentators that want to say this. Right? Or others want to say the story may have happened, but it wasn't like an actual murder. It was like a mock murder, like a Purim spiel kind of thing. And people were freaked out that something went wrong, but it didn't really happen. All kinds of commentaries like that. Now, the big problem is that this rule of Talmudic stories not being literal is limited to sections of the Talmud that are dealing with Agada, that are dealing with homiletics. But anytime the Talmud raises an issue of Jewish law, and the story is written in context of Jewish law, then the story has to be literal, because you can't derive Jewish law from a metaphor. Right. Jewish law has to be derived from realities on the ground, right? Which is why I quoted the first section of the Talmud there, where Rebbe says that a person should be intoxicated to the point he doesn't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai. There are those that understand, and this is a very common understanding, that the reason why the next story follows is to teach you that even though Rabbi just said you're supposed to get that drunk, actually the law is you shouldn't. Why? Because of this crazy story. In other words, this story is like almost a basis for Jewish law, at least in many, many views. Now, if that's the case, then the story has to be literal. You can't take Jewish law from metaphor. To the point, someone mentioned before about women, men and women, so the commentaries discuss whether or not Reb Zeta, when he was revived the next day, did he have to remarry his wife? Because he was temporarily dead. Does he have to now go and take a ring and remarry her with witnesses and the whole thing? Because they're not married anymore. She was a widow for a night. So does he have to remarry? Anyway, I actually saw one interesting commentary which says that proving that it doesn't have to, because comparing it to the Jews at Sinai, whose souls all expired with the Great Revelation, and as a result of that, they didn't have to get remarried. A whole trying to figure out if Rebbe Zera had to get remarried. The point I'm trying to make is that there's real halachic ramification, real Jewish law ramification to the story, and therefore it has to be taken literally in some way, which is completely bizarre.
In that case, too, after Mount Sinai, after being restored, if our souls expired, did we become tamei? Did our bodies become tamei?
That's a very good question, which also is discussed in the commentaries. And the answer is no, they did not. Oh. And it's a whole halachic discussion what the story is, because you have to be alive in contact with the deceased.
And if nobody was alive,
right? So there is a very big discussion about that, whether the people who The fact that they did not become impure, but explaining how and why they didn't become impure is a very big discussion.
Okay.
So, good question.
How about like when you sleep, your soul leaves your body?
A 60th.
Okay.
Or, yeah, 60th, yeah.
Kind of sleep, maybe more.
Maybe more. Yeah. Anyway, it's a very bizarre story which requires explanation that's clear.
Somebody's in a coma and he's not there.
Their soul is certainly there, at least by Jewish law for sure. There are actually recently studies that, I don't know how conclusive they're, but I was just reading an article recently about coma patients who were aware to some degree of their surroundings. This is recent stuff, but by Jewish law, they're certainly still considered alive, so their soul is definitely in their body, even if they're not conscious. Okay, so how do we understand this story? So there was a very, very beautiful explanation, which goes like something like this. I saw a similar thing in the Ben Yehoyada. Anyway, the explanation is as follows. Usually, the Rebbe compares it to the famous story of the sons of Aaron who went into the Holy of Holies and died. And there are a number of reasons given for their death, and it's a little bit ambiguous. And one of the reasons there is that they drank wine before they went into the Holy of Holies. That would seem to be a negative explanation. They drank wine when they shouldn't have drunk wine. Getting drunk and going into the temple, what's this all about? Other explanations seem to suggest that they were so over-enthralled by ecstatic, high, lofty level of spirituality that their souls expired in ecstasy, as it were. And, they just left the bodily realm because of how intoxicated, using that word, they were by spirituality. And the Rebbe suggests a connection between these two, in that the drinking of wine in and of itself symbolizes not wine literally, but wine is associated with secret, right? The famous verse that wine enters the body and the secrets come out. Mm-hmm. On the literal level, it's a commentary on people's behavior. When a person's inebriated and the guards are down, people share things that they wouldn't ordinarily. But deeper, which obviously the verse is referring to something, not just the commentary on someone's intoxication, but rather that wine itself is associated as a metaphor and connected to this idea of revealing secrets, specifically secrets of Torah. Torah itself is referred to many different types of liquids: water, oil, wine, and each type of liquid symbolizes another level or layer of Torah, and wine symbolizes the sod, the secrets of Torah. Right? The secrets of Torah, of course, are delving Kabbalah, which we learn here, delving deeper than just the surface literal story of Jewish law or whatever it is about the Torah, and finding the deeper mystical Kabbalistic meanings of the very texts themselves. So the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and their entry into the Holy of Holies in ecstasy and enjoying the spirituality is related to this idea of drinking wine, and that they overindulged in spiritual mysticism, the secrets of Torah reflected in wine, and thus their souls expired. So it was a great, amazing spiritual yearning. But what they missed is the point that this entire lofty spiritual yearning is all for the purpose of bringing that back to this world, not escaping this world and losing oneself in spiritual, mystical ecstasy, but rather infusing their life with what they have learned from the mystical and spiritual. And that was the piece of the puzzle they were missing, and thus their souls expired.
Maybe they were doing Kiddush.
Presumably. Yeah. So they would suggest that the same thing is true of Rabbi and Rebbe. Even in the names, there were points to that the word Rabbi, which is the fellow who did the slaughtering, Rabbi means the great one. Zera, the one who's on the receiving end of this joyful encounter, means the small one. And the word used here for the occurrence is slaughter, shachtei. Now, usually when the Talmud wants to say murder, it says just that, not slaughter, it says murder, which is the Aramaic word is katle, which means murder. Where here the Aramaic word is shachtei, which means slaughter. Now, it's an unusual choice of words. Even if that was the literal means of murder, like, it's not that important. The manner doesn't have to be so graphic. Just make the point that it was a terrible party and some terrible thing happened, right? So, the Rebbe is pointing to this as very specific language. The halacha is that ein v'shachat elo mashach, which means in order for ritual slaughtering to be pure, the person who's doing the ritual slaughtering has to draw the knife near to them, as opposed to swinging it down. You have to draw the knife near to you, right? That's the motion that has to be done in the physical halachic sense. And therefore, spiritually, what this means is that shchita, even literal slaughtering of animals, is to draw upon the divine energy invested in the animal to elevate it so that humans can eat it and hopefully use the energy that the animal provides to do something loftier with it. So we're mashach, we are drawing on the energy that's in that cow and then using it for a higher purpose. And thus says the Rebbe like this: Rabba, loftier level, the great one, is shachat, is drawing near Zera, the little one, into his secrets, into his wine, into his secrets of Torah, exposing him to a level of spirituality he's not used to. And thus he expired. He couldn't handle it. So the death was literal, but not in the sense that it was a murder in the classic sense, but he overexposed him to his grand, lofty level of spiritual excitement that Zera was consumed and his soul left his body because of it. Which explains why, awkwardly, the next year Rabbi doesn't have the audacity to invite him back. Because Rabbi tells Zera, well, wasn't it great last time when you had this spiritual ecstasy? I brought you back the next day anyway, right? But wasn't it great? So it's not as if you're making the mistakes of the sons of Aaron that you're escaping and never coming back. You're coming back, so it's all good. You'll do this again, right? Or, Rebbe suggests alternatively, maybe Rabbi felt that over the year, Zera matured, gained more knowledge and greater spiritual fortitude, then he might be able to handle the greater level. And therefore, Zera informs him and says, look, thank you, but I'm not there yet, and miracles don't occur all the time, so I can't rely on the fact that I might enjoy this spiritual ecstasy, but I can't rely on the fact that I'm not, but the point is I'm supposed to bring that back to my reality, my world, and therefore, I can't rely on the fact that I may not come back from this great spiritual thing. So it explains the whole story, and it's, first of all, it turns the story from something which is so bizarre into a lofty spiritual experience, and it explains the next year's calm demeanor of the conversation. Hey, you want to come back? It doesn't go on to say Zera took Rabbi to a court and said, what in the world did you just do to me and what's going on? They're still interacting. Next year he sends an invitation, and Zera doesn't say, what, are you out of your mind? He says, well, thanks, but no miracles. All of this stuff is now understood in the context of Rabbi is inviting him for another spiritual journey. And Zera says, look, I'm not at that level. I can't do that. You can be at that level. You can go in these great spiritual ecstasy. Your soul doesn't expire, and the next day you wake up sober and back in this regular world and continue. I can't do that. I have to rely on you reviving me, and I can't rely on miracles. It happened last year, and I'm grateful, but I can't rely on that. So there's two interesting lessons to be taken from here. One, of course, is what we always learn, that the idea of engaging in our spiritual journeys is not to escape our realities, but rather to infuse our realities with the spirituality that we gain. Right? The objective is not to run away from our world and go to shul, metaphorically, but rather the borders of the shul should expand, metaphorically speaking, into the rest of our lives. That's the first lesson. And the other lesson, which is interesting, Rebbe derives is, so there's a question of Jewish law here, right? That's what we began with. And there are those who take the story of Rabba's encounter with Reb Zera as a halachic ruling that one shouldn't drink too much, because look how bad it gets. Now, if we take in the context of this, what that would mean is that there's a dispute. Should you overindulge in spiritual ecstasy or not? That's what this dispute would come down to if we're understanding it this way. Which means those who say drink on Purim would be therefore saying engage in all that spiritual excitement. And the ones who are saying don't drink too much because look, there might be a death, are those saying cautioning against too much overindulge spiritual ecstasy because, hey, you might not come back from that experience. And Jewish law states that one does drink on Purim, which means very rarely is anybody at the level, very rarely is someone at the level of Rabbi, where their spiritual ecstasy is going to lead them to the point where they will literally completely escape our reality. It's not a super concern for most of us. And sometimes our concern is maybe we aren't attaching ourselves enough in the spiritual sense. And therefore, at least on Purim, in these on holidays, on Jewish holidays such state, it's okay if you take a little spiritual detour for a day or two. They'll come back to reality. Don't worry about it. They'll come back to reality, and you'll bring that spirituality with you. But don't get so worried that, oh, my spirituality is too high, I'm going to hold back a bit. That's not the reality for most of us around here. Unless we feel like we're Rabbi or like Aaron's sons, that we might actually not return from that. It's not something we have to be overly worried about. So there's our message from Purim. Enjoy the Purim. Go to the top of that spiritual ladder. And don't worry about it. The next day, God willing, we'll come back and bring that with us to the rest of our year. Wonderful day.